There are so many different lenses to choose from. Today we're gonna be talking about which lens you need to be using for what, and what your next purchase might need to be. Let's get into it. Well, hi there. If you don't know who I am, my name is Tony and I am a filmmaker and photographer. Today we're talking about lenses. Now, when it comes to lenses, a lot of times you may have heard this, you date your camera, but you marry your lenses. You're gonna hold on to your lenses for a lot longer than you will the camera body because the camera, the autofocus is gonna update, the sensor's gonna get better, all of that, but you're going to hold on to these lenses and they're just gonna stay with you for a lot longer than your cameras. So once you kind of figure out your ecosystem, for me, that's Canon. I love the Canon RF lineup. We're shooting on the R5C right now, but I shoot on the R5, the R6, the R5 Mark II. I've shot on the R7, the R8, the R6 Mark II, all of those in that range. I just love these new Canon cameras. And so this is kind of my ecosystem. I shoot all RF lenses. Now, let's talk about lenses for a second. Really, the first thing is that they are subjective. You're gonna learn a style and kind of fall into who you are creatively, and that's okay. That's gonna be different than me, that's gonna be different than the other guy. If you lean more wide or more tight, or you prefer zooms or you prefer primes, it doesn't matter because it's your creative choice, which is such a great thing about photography. Once you figure out the rules, what each lens does, and then you learn your style, then it kind of guides you on what you need to be spending your money on. Second thing is there's a couple different styles of lenses. The first one, like I said, is primes, and the other style is zoom. Prime lens, this is a 35, it's only one focal length. The zoom lens is a 70 to 200, multiple focal lengths, so you can get a lot more variety, but the disadvantage is most of the time, the aperture is either variable, meaning when you zoom out, it goes from 4 to 7.1 or whatever, or it's just not nearly as low of an aperture, meaning it's not gonna let in as much light, give you that blurry background as much as a prime lens. This is an f1.8. 35 millimeter, you're gonna get really blurry backgrounds with it, but the way that you zoom is you have to move into your subject. With this one, I just twist my wrist and I've got a different focal length. Now there's a lot of difference between 70 and 200 when it comes to this. It's not just zooming in like you would digitally. It actually changes your perspective on what's happening. And so when we talk about that, the wider your image is, the less, the less realistic it's gonna look. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the third thing that I wanna talk about before we even start talking about lenses is, let's talk about price point. Not everybody can afford a $3,000 white lens with a red ring, and that's okay. You can still make beautiful content with lenses that are only $200. So let's talk about lenses. There's three kinds of lenses. Now that we've talked about the styles, you've got zooms and primes. Keep those in mind. This applies for all of them. You've got you've got wide, you've got mediums, and then you've got telephotos. And so wide lenses are exactly what they are. I would consider wide lens anything under 35 millimeter. And the reason that I consider a 35 millimeter even a wide lens is because it's kind of wider than we naturally see. We kind of naturally see in that 50 millimeter range. That's subjective, but for me, when I'm shooting on a 50 millimeter, that's kind of the most natural looking image that I can get. There's a lot of reasons to shoot wider than what we naturally see. One is if we're in a tight space and we don't have a lot of room, you can shoot on a 24 and it doesn't look too distorted. Same thing with the 35. The 35 looks really pleasing to a lot of people. And in fact, if you're in video, 35 is just a staple when it comes to look. And so you're gonna see a lot of 35 millimeter. It's really pretty wide, a little bit wider than what we see. Kind of exaggerates the wideness, but it still looks pretty natural that it doesn't have a lot of distortion. So Once you go down 24, that's a little bit wider, a little bit more distorted, and in fact, it kind of makes people look a little bit skinnier if they're in the middle of the frame. As soon as they go out to the outside, it makes them look kind of weird and distorted and kind of wide. So keep that in mind. Then you got 16, which is even wider. You got 14 all the way down to 10. 10 millimeters is ultra wide, and you would use that for something that doesn't necessarily have a person in it. You've got landscape, if you're doing architecture, and your camera is going to help that distortion, because when you get even at 16 millimeters, it's really distorted. And so your camera has built-in distortion correction. Make sure to keep that on. And then once you throw your photos into Lightroom, it also has some camera correction. And so you wanna make sure that you have all of those camera corrections and lens corrections turned on so that it kind of helps that distortion, especially at the ultra wide lens. Okay, so we've got wide lenses. Those are really good for, you know, like I said, architecture, if you're in a tight space, if you're doing real estate videos. A lot of people I know shoot on the 15 to 35 for versatility, but also you could shoot on something like this little guy. This is the 16 millimeter. It's very tiny and very reasonably priced. I think it's maybe, I think you can get it for 250 bucks or something. And this is a great lens. If you wanted to vlog, make sure you keep your face right in the center, but you'll be able to get a really tight shot with your face still in the shot, and it's gonna feel like you're right up on it. So 16 millimeters, this would be a nice little lens for vlogging, especially if your camera has IBIS. The new R5 Mark II looks beautiful with IBIS and a 16 millimeter, much better than the original R6 or the R5. So what IBIS does when you get really wide is the screen starts to just wobble. And so they've done better things with that. The other thing is a lot of times is you just set your camera on a like a table or a tripod or whatever, and just keep that 16 millimeter, walk up to it and talk to it there. You don't have to have your camera moving around vlog style. This lens would work great for any of that. Whenever you're talking to the camera, if you wanna use it for zoom, I've used this for zoom. I've actually used the 16 millimeter and then cropped in just a little bit, and that looks really good. You can use your camera for zooms. I've got a video on that. So if you wanna watch that, you're welcome to. Okay, so we talked about wides. The other thing is mediums. Mediums, what I would consider is around that 50 millimeter range. Some people push that all the way up to 85. It's getting a little tight, and I'll talk why I think that the 50 is kind of the medium range. That's actually what we're shooting on right now. It looks really natural. It looks kind of like what we would see. Now we see way wider than a camera does, a 35 millimeter sensor, because our eyes are just incredible devices that we cannot compete with dynamic range or focal length, any of that. But the 50 millimeter is what we would consider the kind of the closest to what we naturally see. And so that's medium. That's what I shoot on quite a bit. You can use mediums for a lot of things. Documentary style, if you want to just capture something happening. Street photographers use 50 quite a bit. They also use zooms because that lets them get a little bit farther away from the action so that it's still a candid moment. They also shoot in wides, you know, so that, you know, you can capture the entire scene, environmental, things like that. But 50 is good for street photography. It's really good for, you could get some portraits. A lot of people use a 50 millimeter f1.2, what we're using right here, for portraits. Obviously, video is great for 50. When I'm shooting a wedding as a first videographer, I shoot almost the entire wedding on the 50 millimeter. If the rooms that we're getting ready in are really tight, then I'll go with the 24 or 35. But for me personally, I love to shoot on one, a prime, and two, 50 millimeters. Looks beautiful. Okay, so now we get into the telephoto. That's anything from like 85 plus. So 85, 100 millimeters is a really popular one. 135, even the 70 is considered probably, this is a telephoto lens. This goes from 70 all the way to 200. And the thing with zoom, like telephoto lenses, they're beautiful. If you have the space to back up and zoom in, I suggest you do that as much as possible, because what happens is it takes that background and kind of compresses it against your subject, making the background really blurry. So if you have, let's say you have a kit lens, you bought a R50 with the 18 to 45, I think is what it comes with. If you want a blurry background, zoom out all the way to 45. If you've got a 24 to 105, zoom out all the way to 105. Then what you do is get as close to your subject as your composition lets you and move the background as far away as possible, and then you're gonna get blurry background. Even with a cheap kit lens that has a variable aperture that goes up to 7 or whatever it is, you can still get blurry backgrounds with those lenses because of the way that compression works with lenses. It's exaggerated with telephoto lenses. That's why when you see a picture at 200 millimeters, it is just gorgeous. The background is completely blown out. All you see is just bokeh balls, and that's kind of how you can get it without having a very low aperture. Hopefully all that makes sense. Now, how do I use a telephoto lens? One, I use this for like side shots on interviews. If you want, just to be able to really dial in the focus on your subject, you can use a telephoto lens, zoom in, put them in composition, and then get that background really far away, and that makes it look really beautiful and blurry. The other way that I will use a telephoto lens is if I'm really far away from a subject. If I find myself shooting lions in the Serengeti a lot, then I'm gonna hang out with a zoom telephoto lens. If I'm on a safari, if you ever find yourself going to Africa, I've been to, also, it's a fun fact, been to like 10 countries in Africa: Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, doesn't matter. Shoot on the 100 to 500. That's a beautiful range, because there's times when you got little monkeys running up and they're pretty close to the safari vehicle, you want that 100 millimeter. And then there's times when you've got elephants way off in the distance, you want that 500 millimeter. And so that lens is just absolutely perfect for the safari, or if you're going to the zoo, take the 100 to 500. I know that's an expensive lens, rent it. You can play around with it. Those telephoto zoom lenses are really fun. There's also, I think, a 24 to 240 that's a little bit cheaper, that has a variable aperture, but that's a fun lens to kind of play around with. I kind of cut my teeth on the EFS 55 to 250. That lens, I got more than my money's worth out of it. I think I bought it for a couple $100 and just shot it like crazy. You shoot out to 250 millimeters, which is 400 on a crop sensor, like an 80D or R50 or R10, R7. You get that extra focal length. Basically, it's just zooming in more. But that 55 to 250, I just got some beautiful photos with that, and just loved it. The only disadvantage is I think it goes down to like a 7, 7.1, 7.5, something like that. So you need that extra light. But if you're shooting video at 24 frames per second, you double your frame rate, which is 1/50th. That's a whole bunch of information for somebody who doesn't shoot video, but you can have your shutter speed really low with video, letting in a lot of light, so you don't necessarily have to worry about having that aperture as low as possible. Okay, so lots of information. That's the overview. You've got your wide lenses, you've got your medium, and then you've got your telephoto. If you find yourself doing a lot of portrait work, I would suggest shooting over 50 millimeters for those portraits. Now, there's plenty of people that shoot under 50 for portraits, but for the most part, that's a general rule. People like the way that their face looks at 50 and above. Starts to look a little more distorted. The other thing is, if you're shooting on, let's say, 35 millimeter, you gotta get real close to that subject to get the same kind of composition that you would typically see in a portrait style shoot. So you are physically closer to your subject, making them a little bit more uncomfortable. If you're on a 70 to 200, you can have them way down the street, zoom in, get that beautiful blurry background, and get their whole body. So you can be really far away from them, making them feel a little bit more comfortable. If you're shooting documentary style, my suggestion is you shoot something that's very versatile. I've done some work with companies in Ghana where they go into a hospital and they're doing a bunch of surgeries, things like that. one of my main lenses is the 24 to 105 f4. This has a fixed aperture at f4, which isn't great for low light and bokeh, but it does the trick. It's that beautiful mixture of being able to still see what you need to in frame, but it isn't all blurry, and it's, you know, with today's technology, you just crank the ISO and you're good to go. So 24 to 105 gives you all three of the ranges. It gives you wide so you can get establishing shots at the hospital. It gives you medium, so if you need to do interviews, you can do that. And then it gives you telephoto, so if you really need to get in close and look at those surgical tools or whatever it is, it's a really versatile lens for documentary style. I also do this for weddings a lot. I have my second shooter on this, so I will shoot on a 50mm, which kind of sets the stage for natural looking, and then they can shoot really wide to get establishing shots of the buildings, things like that, and then zoom in and get really beautiful shots of, let's say, the vows or the, you know, the moments where we just want to capture those special little unique things. Okay, so we talked about architecture. Typically, those are pretty wide. So if you're doing real estate, 16, 24, you may not want to go too much tighter than that. Portraits are 50 plus. For me personally, I use the 51.2. Typically, if there's one person, at 1.2. If you've got multiple people, then you need to raise your aperture so that everybody's in focus. And then you've got documentary style. That is, I would suggest, a variable, you know, a zoom lens. So what do you need to do? This is what I would suggest. If you're just getting started out, say you got a new camera, let's say it's a crop sensor. I don't care if it's an R10, R50, R7, maybe you got an R8, any of those lower entry level ones. You're excited about photography, you want to get into it, but you just have the kit lens. Let's say it's that 16, whatever it is. I don't even know what it is, 24 to 45, something like that. It's not great. But use that lens, hold that lens, experiment, go ultra wide, go ultra tight, and play around. What do you like, what do you not like? In the meantime, pick up a little lens about this size. It is the RF50 f1.8. This lens is magic. It is, you get into a prime lens, so you get to experience what not zooming with your feet, not zooming with your hand is, but you gotta zoom with your feet. It's gonna be really tight on that crop sensor, which is okay. That's gonna be close to like an equivalent of a 85 or close there. So keep your kit lens, that whatever that is, then get the 50mm f1.8. It's like $200. You can get it on sale for, I don't know, $200, something like that. And then play around with it. And my suggestion is you save up for this lens, this 24 to 105. This should be in everyone's kit. Now, if you find yourself only shooting on primes and only shooting on the 50, then you could upgrade that. But for me, the 24 to 105 is the most versatile lens that is always in my camera bag. I do not leave home without this thing because I can just cover all of it. Like I already said, you can get ultra wide, you can get establishing shots, you can get tights, you can get interview shots, you can get medium shots, you can get, you know, all of it with this one lens. I think that this is the most important lens. Now, they do have a 24 to 105 f2.8. It's huge, it's $3,000. I personally like this lens better, which you can get for about $1,200 right now, which is a lot of money. So what I would suggest, squirrel away $50 to $100 every month. You know, maybe don't go out to dinner one night and put that money towards your 24 to 105, you know, piggy bank. And once you finally get that money saved up, then buy this lens. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. There is a 24 to 105 variable for like $400. I didn't have good luck with it. I thought that the images were soft. I thought that the variable aperture was super annoying, all of those things. But the 24 to 105 f4 is magic. Now, once you get this lens, you're playing around with it, you find yourself leaning mostly to that 80 to 105 side, then your next lens should be a telephoto. Or if you find yourself kind of hanging out that 24 to 50, figure out what that focal range is. If you really like 35 or 24, then get a wide wide lens. That's just kind of the way that I've done it. I personally have a 24-105. I've got the 70-200, which is beautiful. I use this for portraits a lot. 50-1.2 and 70-200. And then I've got a 35mm f1.8 macro. Now this is, the reason I have this lens is I bought it when it came out. It was one of the first lenses that Canon released. It's great because it's a macro. It's only 0.5, so it's not a full 1-to-1 like ratio macro. Doesn't matter. It still lets me get really close to subjects. It's a pretty versatile lens, so I've kept it in my kit. I've got the 16mm, I've got the 51.8, which I don't use that much more, but the 16mm I use quite a bit. And then I also have the 100mm, which I'm getting ready to release a video about this. This one is an OG lens that the RF 100mm replaced the most important product photography lens ever, which is the EF 100mm. If you're taking pictures of things, products, rings, insects, coffee cups, anything like that. If you're trying to start an Etsy store, this is your lens. It looks beautiful. It makes you know, your job so much easier, and this is about $1,000. So I'm gonna make a video on this and how I use this lens. I just don't talk about it enough, so I wanna talk about it. Okay, so all sorts of things. Now, while we're wrapping up this video, the next thing I want you to do is watch. I've got a full video dedicated to why this 24-105 is so important and why it's underrated. A lot of people see that f4 and think they would never buy it. This is a staple. I'm telling you, it's in my camera bag every time. So go watch that video next, and we'll see you in the next one. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't. See you soon.